Hey there everybody, welcome back to my channel. I know it's been a while since I've done a proper tutorial, but we are going to change that. So today we are going to be recreating the bass from the track Messiah by Konflict. Now this is an absolute classic of a tune. This one got me into drum and bass when I was about 14 years old probably. And this is what we're gonna be making today. So this is the Reese without any of the post-processing, and this is what it sounds like straight out of Serum. So this is the patch. It starts off with just a saw wave. So what we want is a saw wave, and we want to set up the patch so it's monophonic, so it only is able to play one note at a time, and then we want to enable legato so then we can use the portamento time here to create some glide time in between these two notes. Now the original Reese plays two notes. It plays a low F0 followed up by a higher E2 note, and these two notes overlap, and that creates the glide in between the notes if we combine it with the monophonic patch with legato turn on and the portamento time turned up. So the portamento time is 90 milliseconds, pretty straightforward. This is what we get right now. So next thing up, this patch needs some movement. So what I did is I turned the unison up to 2. Now this creates two voices, and what we get is this. So it becomes wider, but I don't want it to be wide. What I want a monophonic sound, and I want to have an oscillation in the sound that is that characteristic movement that you hear in a lot of Reese basses. So how we can achieve that is with the unison turned up to 2, we can bring the width of oscillator 1 all the way down to 0. Now what that does is it basically forces those two stereo voices into the center, so in the mid. So now these two voices are mono, and because they're slightly different in terms of pitch, it creates some movement and we get some oscillation. And that is that classic sound that you hear in Reese basses. So the oscillation speed is determined by the unison detune. So this knob right here controls how quick the speed goes. If I bring this up, the speed is quicker. If I bring this down, the speed is slower. So this is what you want to tweak for both the pitch that you're using and for the tempo. So my tempo is 174, and in combination with the two notes that I'm playing, I had to tweak this to set it to 0.19 on the unison detune. If you use different notes, that will also change the oscillation speed of that Reese. So if you use a different note for the higher note, then you might also want to tweak this detune amount to get the right speed on that oscillation that you're looking for. Okay, so by default, the random phase is all the way up, and that will mean that every time this bass triggers, it finds a different starting position for each voice along the cycle of this waveform. Now, what that does is it creates slight inconsistencies every time a bass is being triggered, and that is not necessarily a big problem right now. You don't really hear it, but as soon as we apply a lot of stuff like distortion and stuff like that, you're gonna hear a big change in terms of the sound. So to get rid of that, we can bring the random phase all the way down, and that way every time the voices are being triggered, they start from the same start position, and thus the bass will sound consistent every single time it hits. So, after that, we're gonna enable the sub oscillator, because we want to have some sub, and I hear one specific thing. I want to have the sub on the low note, but I don't want to have that sub on the higher note. So what I did is I went into here and enabled the note modulator here, brought that up by clicking it, and I changed this graph. So if you look at this graph, when I play the audio, the low note, and then stop while the low note is playing, you can see a line here. You can already see it. It's a little dotted line. And if I now move this around, you can see where those lines are, right? Those dotted lines. That is the pitch of the low note. That is where the low note sits in terms of pitch. So what I did is I made a point here, and I dragged that point to be right where that dotted line is, so that it starts right at that position. Then I did the same for the higher note. So if I play the high note, you can see that same line appear. So I made another point and dragged that right to where that position is. So now I tweak the note modulator to basically have the range that I want it to be. So now it ranges from that F0 up to that E2 note. So now I can apply this note modulator to anything I want, so that I can achieve different results on the low note and the high note without doing any automation. So we didn't want any sub on the high note, remember? So I took the note modulator and I applied it in a reverse direction on the level of the sub. So let me turn it back on. So this is what it does now. So you can hear that on the low note we have sub, and on the high note the sub goes away. Next one up, I added the noise oscillator as well, set it to bright white, so that's sort of like a high-passed white noise, so that we don't have to filter it and get rid of the low end. And then I applied the same note modulator to the level of the noise. So on the high note, on the higher Reese note, we get a bit of noise mixed in, but on the low note, it's basically turned all the way down. Very subtle, but it does add a little bit of noise on that higher note. Next up, we have a filter, and on this filter I'm using a high pass and a notch as well. So the notch itself here is being controlled by the note modulator as well. So the note modulator, sort of like, it just brings the frequency of this one down a bit. Same thing, I've also applied this to the high pass filter. So if I turn that back on, I didn't want any low frequencies on the higher note. So on the high note, it now goes up on the high pass, so we get this. So now I also want to see if there's anything of these. Yeah, so I have macro number 1, which is giving... It's basically adding the main movement. So this is the automation for macro 1, and it's creating most of the movement in this Reese. So I've attached that to the frequency here of the notch as well, and it's set to bipolar, so it goes both below the position of this knob and above this position of this knob. So if I turn that on, we will get more movement on that notch filter that is following this automation. So it just adds more movement. Now that is everything for this first page, and now we're going to go into the effects tab. So, first effect is a phaser. Now this one is pretty subtle. I brought the phase stereo all the way down so that we don't get any offset on the stereo. I don't want it to introduce any weird stereo effects that might make it harder to mix this one. So all I did is brought that down, and then I brought the feedback down as well. And then playing around with the rate, which I set to 6 bars, and then playing around with the depth and the frequency knobs will sort of like allow you to achieve particular kind of tones out of this Reese. I also brought the mix down to about 50%. So this is without, and this is with. Very subtle, you probably almost don't hear a change at all, but it's these slight little differences that make a huge change in the end when we start applying more post-processing. So next one up is the distortion module. I used the X-Shaper mode and I drawn a little shape like this. So very straightforward, just changed that shape, created a point, and just made it from this into something like that. Not that important, just there to add some more grit to the sound. Then I have nothing on shape B, so that's just a regular linear line, and then I set the drive to be, I guess, about 11 o'clock, so somewhere in between those two shapes. So we're not going to get the full distortion of this shape, but we're somewhere in between these two shapes. And then I brought the mix down to about 50%, so that we get both the dry version and then the distorted version. So this is the fully distorted version. Now you can also really hear that noise being brought up. So this is the without the noise. And then this is with the noise. See, so before the noise was very subtle, but now after the distortion we can clearly hear that noise being brought up. Now, I didn't want that much distortion though, so I brought this down to about 47-ish%. Just to add some more grit to the sound. Next up is the chorus. This chorus pretty straightforward as well. Don't think I changed too much here. The only thing I probably changed is I brought the feedback down, and I switched this from a low-pass chorus, so by default it's low-pass. I switched it by clicking on LPF, so it switches to HPF, which stands for high-pass filter, and I haven't changed this cutoff position. So what this does, it basically means that we now have a high-pass chorus, so with the mix all the way up, see, we can hear that the chorus is high-passed, and then just mix that in with about 20-ish%. Next up is the hyper dimension module. I'm only using the hyper section. Haven't changed anything here, I think. All I did was bring the mix down to about 9 o'clock, so that way we get a little bit more stereo width, and we also get a little bit more of a washed out sound on the Reese. Next up, I added the multiband compressor. I didn't really play around with any of these. The only thing I did is I brought the gain up here, and I brought the mix down to about, I guess, 9:30 o'clock, something like that. And this squeezes some more high end out of the sound. So next up we have the low pass filter on the end of the effects chain, and this low pass filter is being controlled by a couple of things. Macro 1, which is where you could see the automation from, is controlling this filter right here. So first thing we have is we have a low pass plus a notch on a 12 dB per octave filter. So we have the low pass filter here, and this is the notch. So if I turn Macro 1's automation on the low pass, you can hear what happens. So you can see that during this section it's low passed, then here the filter opens up, then in this section it closes back down, becomes more low passed again on the higher note here, stays low passed for the low note, then the high note is more opened up on the filter again. Here it starts to slowly close back down. Here we have a more low passed version again, stays low passed for this first low note, then goes back up, opens up the filter again, and then closes it down on the end again. So that's kind of like the movement that I could hear in the original track and that I tried to copy as close as possible. So next up, we have one more movement on the notch filter here. So that's also being controlled by the same macro. So if I bring that up again, it's just sweeping that notch filter up and down a little bit along with this one, just to create some extra movement. So now let me just quickly check if all the modulations are back on. Yes, okay. So that is it for Serum. We can close Serum down, and we can now go into the post-processing. So the post-processing was pretty simple. It's just a couple of subtle effects, basically. It looks a little complicated, but it's not that complicated. So first up, I have a utility making everything mono underneath 120 Hz, just to be sure, so that we have a mono sub. Then we have an auto filter with a notch, just adding some more movement. This one is set to 4 bars, about 12.5%, and that is just creating some more movement in the mid-range. Pretty subtle, but it just helps to add more movement. Then I decided to add some EQing. Now I did these in separate EQs, but you could just as well do these in one EQ. I did them in separate EQs so I could show better what they do both. So first I got rid of some of these low mids, so I felt they were a little bit powerful, and comparing the original Reese to my version, I could hear that my version had more low mids, so I just decided to add this EQ, which cuts some of those low mids away. And then I also felt it had too much sub, so I added this EQ, which is a low shelf, which just takes down all the low frequencies from about 200 Hz and down. So next up, we have a rack right here. First thing we have is we have 2 bands, and the first band, the bottom band here, is the sub, so that's the sub. and then we have the mid-range right there. So the sub is, I'm doing this with the multiband dynamics. I've set the low band, the crossover point between the low and the mid band to 350 Hertz, and I soloed the low band on this bottom chain. So what that does is it only plays this low band, and that way I can hear just the sub. Same thing I did on this band. Basically copied over the same multiband dynamics, pasted it on this one. This time I soloed the mid band, and I also turned off the high band so that we only have one band for the mids and highs together. So that way I can process the mid and highs separately from the sub. So what did I do on the sub? I only added a limiter, which is just squeezing it down a little bit on with the ceiling. So the ceiling is brought down and the gain is being pushed into that. So it's just basically cutting off any louder peaks that might pop up every now and then, and makes the sub feel more consistent. So you can see on those low notes, especially on the start of the note, it just quickly adds a little bit of gain reduction, and it just evens out that little peak that happens at the start of the note. That's basically because the two voices of the unison in Serum are starting at the same position when a note is being triggered. That first initial hit of the bass is slightly louder than the rest of the sound when the voices drift further apart. So to get rid of that sudden peak in volume, I just added that limiter to just squeeze that volume down a bit when that bass is being triggered. And you can see it as well. Every time the low note hits, you can see a slight amount of gain reduction happening on this meter right here. See? So that's just a little small tip to keep that low end in control. So then on the mid band, I first added a little bit of erosion. Just adds a little bit of noise to the higher frequencies. This is very subtle, but it adds some stereo noise. I also added an amp after it, and this amp, you can see my settings right here. This amp will then bring up that noise a little bit more. So this is without. And then this is with, and listen to the higher note. So it just brings that noise up a little bit more and makes it a little bit more audible. And then I decided to add a chorus to that high frequency band as well, to kind of wash the higher frequencies out a little bit more. When I listened to the original Reese, I could hear that there was a clear raspy sort of like high end, pretty gritty high end, but at the same time there was also some more washed out high end mixed in between. So I achieved that by using this high passed chorus. So if I bring the dry wet all the way up, that's what it sounds like, and then I just brought the dry wet down to about 30% to just mix some of that washed out high end into the original Reese. That's it for those two layers, those two bands, and then this is what they sound like together. So next up we have an EQ, again taking out some high end and as well rolling off all of the low frequencies, but I'm using a very gentle curve. I'm not using the steep high pass curve. I'm only using a 12 dB per octave curve, so it's not cutting all the sub bass completely. It's just making it a little bit quieter the lower we go in terms of pitch. And I just did that because I felt there was a little bit too much sub in that Reese. So next up we have a phaser. This one is very subtle again. But what it does is I set this phaser to the space mode, and I only used one pole, really low feedback, and then brought the frequency down to about somewhere in the mid frequencies. And then by bringing the dry wet down, we just add a little bit of that phasery kind of sound to it. It's set to 6 bars, so that's a pretty slow rate. This one is pretty subtle, it's not really needed, to be quite honest. So then we have OTT, and I think this one brings up the noise even more. So we added some noise earlier. It's still pretty subtle in the mix, and I think this OTT will bring up that noise a lot. So this is with. It really brings up the high frequencies, and it also evens out the frequency spectrum a little bit more, making things a little bit more consistent all the way throughout the frequency spectrum, which is kind of what we want for this type of sound. I did make some slight changes. I brought the timing up here so that we don't get too much high end, and I also brought the amount down to about 50%. Then I added one final chorus. Again, I felt it needed to be more washed out than what it already was, so I just added another slight layer, of course, with the dry wet brought down, just to give it a little bit more of that washed out kind of sound. Then I have another rack doing some frequency splitting. Again, we just have a low band and a higher band. So low band, mid band, and a high band, of course. It's mid and highs together. On the low band, just did some saturation. So it's just bringing up the sub a little bit more and adding a little bit of saturation to the sub. And on the mid band, I only did some EQ, so just boosted these two areas. So that together. So now we're gonna go into the final thing. When I listened to the original Reese, there's one clear thing I could hear, and that is that the original Reese was pretty much entirely mono, except for the high frequencies. So, what did I do, is I took an EQ8, and I switched it from stereo mode to mid-side mode, and I created this shape in the mids, so I rolled off a lot of the high frequencies. I felt the high frequencies were getting a bit too sharp, a bit too harsh, so rolling them off with a very gentle curve makes for that you don't remove the high frequencies completely, but you're just rolling them off gently, so they're still there, but they're just quieter, and the further we go up in terms of the frequency spectrum, the quieter they get. Now, I did that on the mid band, and I also did that on the side band. Now, on the mid band, I also brought down the low mids a little bit, and a little bit right here around 1.5 kilohertz. And then on the side band, I used a steep high pass this time, and I high passed it around 1.4 kilohertz, so that only this little region here is stereo. So this is before. Now the Reese is already fairly mono, but we can still hear some stereo bits happening in the lower frequencies and in the low mids. So then I added that EQ. Basically making sure that none of those frequencies below this point are stereo. So then one final thing, a limiter to crank up the volume. This is where a lot of the grit and powerful, or a lot of the power comes from. Brought the ceiling down a little bit so that we are not going to get a really loud sound. And this is all just tweaked to taste, comparing it to the original Reese, so this is not that important. But what is important is that you bring up the gain on this limiter. Make sure that you see a little bit of gain reduction on this meter, so you know that it's doing some limiting, and this is basically just bringing the volume back up again, because this EQ took out a lot of the volume, and then this limiter brings that volume back. So this is before, and then this is after. So that's it for the Reese. That's the entire Reese. Now there's one other thing I wanted to show you, and that's the vocal, of course. So, I have the original sample right here. The original sample is from the track Rosala, Are You Ready to Fly? It's an old dance tune, and I think the original vocal sample for Konflict Messiah was sampled from the particular version of that track, the Marauder a cappella mix. When I listen to that version of the track, I just hear that sample and I'm thinking, yeah, I think it's that version that they sampled. Maybe he sampled the original track, I'm not sure, but I decided to pick this one. So this is a small cut from that long track. As you can see, it's an entire track, and I just cut out a very small section that happens around the 53-second mark, and I will link these videos in the bottom description of this video as well. So I will link the original sample track, I will link Konflict Messiah track as well in the description. So if you haven't seen those, or if you haven't heard those, go check them out. Now, this is the original sample, and if we pitch that down 11 semitones, this is what we get. Now that sounds exactly like what we hear in Konflict's track, right? So I went and put that into a sampler, and I set up a loop in the sampler, because we want that to extend that vocal note along this entire section. So in this MIDI clip, I have one long C3 note, and in here I have the pitched version of the sample, so the pitched down version. So with that loop, what we get is this. See, we're basically extending that last section and we're looping it so that we can basically have that vocal going on during this entire section. And we only hear the start of the vocal at the start of this section as well. So I did a couple of things to it. A little bit of EQ, taking down some of the frequencies I don't want. Decided to add a little bit of reverb to blend these loop points a little bit. So if you listen, you can still hear that it clearly loops. And I didn't really like that, so I decided to add some reverb to kind of basically just smear these crossfades a little bit and just add some reverb over them so that it sounds less like it's looping. You can still hear the loop, but in the mix it's a lot less obvious than without the reverb. It just sounds more like a sustained sound that way. So then I add a little bit of saturation to beef the vocal up a bit, give it some more grit. Then we have an EQ, and this is taking out some really two specific frequencies that I didn't like. So without those, this is what it sounds like. Now there is a pad in the original track, and that pad you can hear there are some resonances from that pad still left in the vocal. So I decided to cut those out with 2 notches. So the first one, and then the second one. And it makes the vocal a lot cleaner. So after that, some distortion with isotope trash. This is distorting the high frequencies. So nothing going on these bands right here. Only on the high band I added a little bit of the crunchy grunge and I brought the mix down here. Because I was listening to the original track and I heard that the vocal had some grit to it. It felt like it had been degraded in some kind of a way. Maybe some noise was added to the vocal sample or something along those lines. Maybe it was ran through a mixing desk or some other analog gear or whatever. The original track, Messiah, is pretty old, so I think the track was probably made with quite a bit of hardware, whether that be hardware samplers or hardware synths or hardware processing, hardware effects, it doesn't matter. But the track is old, so there's a bigger chance that it involves using hardware than software, because those days software was a lot less good at what it is than it is these days. So I decided to add some saturation to the high frequencies to kind of mimic that effect. Then I did that another time, but this time with FabFilter Saturn. So this as well, we have the clean tape on the low band, not really doing much, and then we have on the high band the warm tape really cranked up a lot. So what this does, it just adds more distortion to those higher frequencies. So this is without, and then this is with. Now, this sounds very distorted and it becomes a little bit harsh, it doesn't sound too pleasing, but in the mix it made sense. So, on its own it sounds a little weird, but in the mix it kinda did the job. Now, one slight EQ, final EQ, because this saturation introduces some low frequencies again, so I'm just high passing it again and boosting some of this range right here to kind of make the vocal more upfront. So that's it. And together with the Reese, it sounds like this. So that was it for this video. I hope you liked it. Now, before I end this video, I wanted to make a little extra disclaimer. After a lot of requests, I have decided to launch a Patreon page. So you can now go to my Patreon page using the link in the description below this video, and you can help me out and donate some money if you want me to do more of these videos. You can also join my Discord community, which is of course linked in the description, and I will see you guys back on a live stream. Now, I do these live streams every Friday at 8:30 p.m. Amsterdam time, so check out what that is for your time zone. I'm going to be doing more tutorials as well, so leave a comment below with the ideas for tutorials that you have, what you wanted to see, and also if you are new here, then please subscribe to this channel. It would mean a lot. I'm trying to get this channel up to 100,000 subscribers. So that's it for this video, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Peace.